Can the Linux kernel cause hardware problems? Have you ever wondered if the Linux kernel could be the reason for hardware issues on your computer? It's a great question and one that many users encounter. Let's break it down. The Linux kernel is the heart of the Linux operating system. It manages how software interacts with hardware. However, it does not directly cause hardware problems. Instead, issues often arise from how the kernel interacts with hardware components through drivers and firmware. Drivers are essential software modules that allow the kernel to communicate with specific hardware devices. While the Linux kernel includes many drivers, not all hardware is fully supported. If the kernel does not have the correct driver for a device, that hardware may not function correctly or at all. Sometimes, drivers are built into the kernel, but other times, you may need to install third-party drivers manually. Without the right drivers, hardware can behave unpredictably, which might seem like a hardware problem. Firmware is another factor to consider. Some hardware needs firmware, which are binary files loaded into the device to enable its functions. The Linux kernel may not include all necessary firmware by default. If firmware is missing, it can lead to hardware malfunctions or limited functionality. Kernel version is also important. Older versions of the kernel might not support newer hardware, leading to issues. Regular updates to the kernel often improve driver support and hardware compatibility. However, using very new or experimental kernel versions can sometimes introduce bugs that affect hardware stability. Kernel modules play a role too. The kernel uses modules to add or remove hardware support dynamically. If modules are incorrectly loaded or incompatible, they can cause hardware to malfunction. In some cases, users may need to compile a custom kernel to support specific hardware fully. Certain hardware may have quirks or bugs that are challenging to manage through the kernel. For example, some graphics cards requiring proprietary drivers for optimal performance. Using open-source drivers may lead to performance or stability issues. Legacy hardware can also be a concern. As new kernel versions are released, support for older hardware may be dropped. This can cause hardware that once worked to stop functioning correctly with updated kernels. In practical terms, while the Linux kernel manages hardware effectively in most cases, problems attributed to the kernel usually stem from driver or firmware issues. These are not physical damage or inherent faults in the hardware. Users can avoid these issues by ensuring they use a kernel version that supports their hardware, installing the right drivers and firmware, and checking hardware compatibility lists before installing Linux on specific machines. This highlights a key difference in how Linux operates compared to other major operating systems. Linux's open-source nature means hardware support can vary. It often requires manual intervention or advanced configuration to ensure everything works smoothly. So, while the Linux kernel does not cause hardware problems in the sense of damaging devices, it can lead to functionality issues when driver or firmware support is lacking. Keeping your kernel updated and ensuring proper driver installation are essential steps to avoid these problems.